So our next presentation is from Derek Milton, who's a principal scientist at Phoebe Chimney. He's going to report on the recommendations of the Biomass Combustion Emissions Study, which was also funded by the SEI under the RD&D scheme and was initially contracted through IrBEA. I think we've already spoken today about how important it is to get this right for sustainability and for the development of the industry, and in terms of thinking about public acceptance, but also about public health and general environmental issues. I think it's something we all should be aware of and conscious of, not just purely so that people let us continue as we are. So, Derek, if you'd like to.
Afternoon, everyone. I suppose I better start with a confession. I misread the length of time that I had actually for this presentation. I thought I had 30 minutes, but I've only 20, so I was frantically cutting out slides yesterday before I sent it, so hopefully I'll try and get it finished within the timeline allowed. I suppose that was, as has been identified, IrBEA commissioned, or had commissioned Felly Timney to undertake a study to assess potential impacts associated with the increased biomass combustion in Ireland, as expected from the RHI implementation and rollout, and to assess the potential impact that might have on air quality. I think it was a very proactive step by IrBEA to undertake this study so that relevant issues can be identified and considered by policymakers during policy development, and particularly in light of the RHI at the moment. The identified project was supported by SEI through the RD&D fund and was prepared under the oversight of a project steering committee. The project steering committee comprised policymakers, comprised fuel manufacturers, appliance manufacturers, consultants, and we also had input from Campbell Palmer consultants in the UK as well, which was very beneficial as well. The main focus of the study was in relation to what we termed the community, commercial and industrial scale biomass development that may be eligible for the proposed RHI, but we also try to address where possible the domestic scale side of things as well. We had a limited time and budget, so we essentially could only really undertake an overview assessment of the relevant factors. And I suppose that some of the issues identified and recommendations made could be considered as starting points for further investigations, perhaps. As a first step, we prepared a technical literature review, which we've included as Appendix 1 to the main project report, that identified really the relevant topics and issues in relation to biomass combustion and the emissions therefrom. And again, based on the issues that the technical literature review identified, I suppose you can identify the main factors that influence emissions from biomass combustion under the broad headings of fuel type and quality, appliance type, design, operation, maintenance, and appliance installation. A project report was prepared that focused on those above factors, and we made 12 recommendations based on those topics, and I'm going to go through those shortly. We had a public consultation period in October, and the final project report was released in November and is available on at the website below, and I think also on the SEAI website. Just a couple of slides then in terms of what are we talking about when we consider biomass emissions. I suppose the emissions of relevance from biomass combustion are particulate matter, the component parts identified there, the oxides of nitrogen, oxides of carbon, oxides of sulfur, dioxins and furans. I suppose it's important to point out that these aren't just emissions associated with biomass combustion. They're, to some extent, to some form or other, they are obviously associated with combustion of all types of fuels. But primarily the ones that are of interest and I suppose concern, for want of a better word, from the biomass side of things are particulate matter and oxides of nitrogen. PM, particulate matter, is really used as a health indicator in terms of air quality. It's generally classified as PM10 or 2.5 depending on the micron size, and I suppose studies have shown that both long and short-term exposure can have a number of health related impacts. PM10 is the thoracic fraction, and that can be deposited in your lungs and deposited in your upper airways and then settle in your lungs, while PM2.5 can actually be directly passed into the bloodstream. Oxides of nitrogen, NO2 again has some health impacts in terms of bronchitic symptoms of asthmatics, and also can contribute to the formation of ozone, a greenhouse gas, and PM as well through a sort of a secondary formation process in the atmosphere, and also environmental impacts there when it forms with sulfur dioxide forming acid rain and the knock-on effects there. I had a couple of slides in with numbers to compare the emissions from biomass combustion versus those with oil, gas and coal, for example. I took them out because in the interest of time, but I'd refer you back to the project report. There's a number of sources in there that will be are useful for actual numbers on the issue, and also the European Environment Agency EMEP program provides quite a bit of information in terms of emissions inventory as well, which is a useful information source. Just before I get into the recommendations, I suppose we want to identify a couple of pieces of legislation here and standards that apply, because we do refer to them in the recommendations. I suppose it gives an idea of what's out there in terms of control of emissions for appliances. I suppose the factors that I mentioned there previously in terms of fuel type and quality, in terms of appliance design, installation, operation, maintenance, etc. I suppose they all kind of merge together really to result in the emission or the emission of a parameter, if that's the right way to put it, at a certain level, and then trying to cap those emissions through an emission limit value is really, I suppose, crucial. The application of emission limit values is crucial really to the control of emissions associated with biomass combustion. So in that regard, you would think that there are a lot of legal emission limit values or legal instruments that apply emission limit values out there that would be appropriate to the sector. Not actually the case at the moment. I suppose depending on the scale of a biomass appliance, now we're looking here from small scale up to potentially very large scale. If you had an appliance that fell within a 50 or greater than a 50 megawatt thermal input, there may not be too many of those, but they would come under the remit of the Industrial Emissions Directive, the IE directive, which is transposed into Irish legislation through 137/138 of 2013, and applies, as I said, emission limit values that have a legal standing, and that's legal standing in the country, and they're enforced through the EPA industrial emissions licensing regime. In terms of, just to put a bit of numbers on it, it's represented, PM is represented as dust in that legislation, but you're looking at a level of around 20 milligrams per metre cubed for dust, and between 150 and 250 milligrams per metre cubed for NOx as well in the Industrial Emissions Directive. And that's actually it in terms of what's currently in place as a legislative instrument at the moment in terms of ELVs. If you do operate under an IPC license or in a waste facility or in another industrial emissions activity licensed activity through the EPA, then you would have emission limit values applied to any emission from combustion in that regard. But if you're not in that regime or any of those regimes, then there is no legal emission limit value that applies at the moment. Now, what I mentioned when we were speaking before lunch, what is coming down the road is the Medium Combustion Plant Directive, which will cover combustion plants greater than 1 megawatt, less than 50 megawatts. So it could well be the case that a number of future appliances developments will follow within that scale. That is to be transposed into national legislation by the end of the year. I spoke to the department in preparing for the presentation, and they've informed me that it is on the administrative workload for the department this year. They haven't yet applied or identified a competent authority. Obviously, the EPA are the competent authority in terms of the IE directive. It may be the case that there's a similar commonality there, but that decision is not yet made. So the MCP, when it's in place, will have a legislative footing. It'll identify what they're classing as existing MCPs and new MCPs. A new MCP will be anything after December 2018. So one would assume that there will be a regime in place prior to December 2018 in order to capture these new facilities. So it's likely then, as I said, that there will be some sort of a licensing or permitting regime applied when the legislation is transposed from that point of view, which will apply emission limit values to combustion appliances, biomass combustion appliances at that time. The Eco-Design Directive is in place through the National Eco-Design Regulations, and there are two regulations of relevance, 1185, which relates to solid fuel local space heaters less than 50 kilowatts, so essentially domestic scale boilers, domestic scale stoves and similar appliances, and then Commission Regulation 1189, which refers to solid fuel boilers less than 500 kilowatts. Now, while they are in place through national legislation at the moment, they're actually delayed in terms of their implementation. They won't be implemented with 1185 implemented by January 2022 and 1189 by January 2020. Between them, depending on the technologies, 1185 you're looking at PM limits between 20 and 50 milligrams per metre cubed, and NOx at 200 milligrams per metre cubed, so comparable to Industrial Emissions Directive. sorry, I didn't outline the emissions ELVs associated with the MCP. You're looking there at between 20 and 50 milligrams per meter cubed for PM. That's again expressed as dust, and you're looking at between 300 and 650 milligrams per meter cubed expressed as NOx. So again, quite stringent emission limit values, and the eco design related regulations apply similar ones in that regard. But again, there's a lag period before they come into place. So in the absence of those legislative instruments, what applies at the moment is EN 3035/2012, which is a voluntary standard for appliances less than or equal to 500 kilowatt thermal output, so slightly different in terms of thermal input, and that does incorporate ELVs in terms of dust, again depending on the scale and type, between 40 and 150 milligrams per meter cubed in that regard. What you might notice is that even when the Regulation 1189 does come into play with the 500 kilowatt appliances, there will be a gap between that 500 kilowatt and the 1 megawatt scale appliances in terms of application of ELVs. That's acknowledged at the European level. I understand that there is going to be further legislative developments to address that, but that gap does exist. So as it stands today, there are very little legislative ELVs applied by our national legislation, but there are obviously ones coming down the road. I'm going to go through each of the 12 recommendations now. Apologies, some of them are a bit wordy, so I might just kind of skip through them, and I just wanted to give you the background then as to what we were thinking when we made those recommendations. So the first one was the link qualification for the proposed RHI with the requirement to demonstrate adequate operational control of emissions through fuel quality assurance, WFQA or similar, for predominantly non-domestic smaller scale appliances, and then appropriate fuel supply monitoring, combustion emissions monitoring for larger scale appliances not operating under a permit, but in the first instance compliance with an appropriate air emission license or permit. And again, the reason we made that reference is to consider the upcoming implementation of the MCP directive. And again, the suggested organisations that would apply to would be DCCAE and EAFM in terms of WFQA oversight. Again, the background behind that was to, I suppose, require the capture of the positive influence that wood fuel quality can have on lowering emissions, particularly in instances where emission limit values aren't in place by a licence or a permit. Obviously, we suggested that would be supported by an appropriate maintenance regime. Other methods for larger scale appliances that may not have a permit could be, as I said, the appropriate fuel supplier monitoring, but there may be limited examples of those when the MCP directive does come into play. And as we discussed earlier on, the RHI consultation document does make reference to the WFQA adoption as part of the RHI. As I said before, I think there are maybe a couple of questions around that just might need to be a little bit more nuanced in terms of capturing non-woody fuels and how to quality assure those, and again how we'll consider the implementation of the MCP when that does occur. Again, recommendation 2 was a sort of a broadening of that of the WFQA beyond the RHI. So that was to consider the broadening of the WFQA and essentially its placement on a legislative footing, and also to consider the mandating of wood fuel purchase through green public procurement for facilities, again not covered by an emission licence or permit. Again, the background, as I said, was an expansion of the first recommendation beyond RHI to focus more on the domestic market, suggesting to put the WFQA or similar on a mandatory footing to essentially increase the uptake of quality assured wood fuel and utilisation throughout the country. I suppose an issue there that would need to be considered is the impact of the traded and non-traded wood sectors. Obviously, traded wood being the formal commercial sale of wood fuel through garage forecourts or garden centres or wherever it is sold, and obviously the non-traded then being sort of more private interactions in terms of selling wood. I think it's kind of been acknowledged that it's acknowledged that if you do put something like WFQA on a mandatory footing, you will have, I suppose, always enforcement issues to deal with in terms of the non-traded sector as well. So that's always going to be a challenge going forward. Green public procurement obviously represents an opportunity to influence the purchase of quality assured fuel, and that's currently not addressed in the green public procurement guidelines. I think this was kind of exemplified by during the course of carrying out the study. A local authority tendered for the supply of wood chip and wood pellet to a number of their sites, but without any real reference to wood fuel quality as a requirement of the tender process. So an example of a missed opportunity there. Recommendation 3 was in terms of developing an early engagement program with SCAI and or DEGI with biomass appliance manufacturers to facilitate and encourage the adoption of the eco-design regulations that I identified earlier. SAI and DEGI were identified because both will have a role in terms of the eco-design market surveillance and eco-design directive implementation, so that's why they were suggested. It was considered beneficial to, I suppose, have early engagement with appliance manufacturers to ensure that when these dates come around in January 2020 and January 2022, that all measures have been taken to ensure that appliances being placed on the market are compliant. Again, recommendation 4 was around developing specific policy measures to promote EN 303/5/2012 and also the eco-design requirements and the WFQA scheme. So I suppose in the absence of those being in place at the moment, the thinking was there should be some policy measures to promote what is there in terms of EN 303/5 in terms of awareness, as I said, to address the lag period certainly until 1189 comes into force. Recommendation 5 was to consider the development of an implementation of a communication and awareness strategy. We cite the National Clean Air Strategy there, which will present information to the public on pertinent issues relating to biomass combustion. Obviously, the benefits of a communication and awareness strategy are pretty obvious, and I spoke again with the department in preparing for the presentation here, and they have the National Clean Air Strategy consultation is imminent. It was intended that it was going to be out before Christmas, but that hasn't yet happened. But they have confirmed that the communication and awareness element of that strategy does make reference to the WFQA, does make reference to biomass appliances. So certainly when that comes out, it might be useful. It would be worthwhile to respond to that consultation as well. It'll be interesting to see what recommendations it has in there. Recommendation 6 came from feedback from the project steering committee in relation to, and it's around introducing flexibility to the building regulations 2014 to allow, particularly in relation to flue sizing, to allow the recommendations of manufacturers and our installers of domestic size appliances to be implemented. The technical guidance document J that supports the regulations makes a number of specific recommendations and requirements for biomass heating appliance installation. However, they make recommendations for minimum sizing of flues for different appliances, and it was, as I said, the feedback we received was that in some cases that may be too restrictive, and thus the appliances, if they must be installed at those sizes, then they may not be operating at an optimum in an optimum manner. So some sort of an amendment perhaps to the building regulations might incorporate that flexibility that was recommended. Recommendation 7 again kind of ties into what we were talking about before lunch in terms of the use of the UK RHI emission certificate system, and I suppose we'd recommend the adoption of that in the situation where there is no air emissions permit or license or no ELVs applied by SAME. I said we suggest to support that recommendation by verifying the applicability of their emission limit values in an Irish context, and then assessing the interaction of these values with the requirements of both eco-design and the MCP directives. I suppose the background again was to ensure that emissions-linked performance became a central tenet of the RHI, and I suppose we had suggested that where ELVs are in place or will be in place through a license or licensing and permitting regime, that would be considered as an appropriate emissions control mechanism. It makes sense perhaps that the UK system will be adopted where appropriate, given that there's likely to be crossover in terms of product types between the two markets and products that already have existing emission certificates. We suggested again the suitability for the adoption of those the ELVs that they outline, just a body of work to verify that the 30 grams per gigajoule for PM and 150 for NOx is applicable in an Irish context. But also we recommend, and as I said previously, there is I think a body of work to be undertaken in terms of the interaction of the UK RHI values with the MCP directive when it comes into play. And I suppose the reason being that if you carry out a calculation, as I said, the UK RHI values and the MCP directives are in different units, grams per gigajoule of input versus milligrams per meter cubed of out the stack, if you like. When you do the crossover calculation or the algorithm to compare those values, you actually see that in some instances in terms of PM10, the UK RHI value as milligrams per meter cubed is less stringent than the MCP and it's in the midpoint for NOx, depending again on the scale of the MCP plants that we'll be looking at. So potentially, unless this issue is considered a little bit more, you could have a case where if the RHI is in place before the MCP comes into existence, you could be compliant with the requirements of the values there for the UK RHI ELVs. But when MCP comes into play, you may not actually be able to comply with the emissions associated with the ELVs required for that directive. So again, I think a body of work, I don't know what the particular answer is to it, but I think there is certainly a body of work to be undertaken to see how those two pieces of those two requirements interlink, shall we say. I'll run through what's left. Again, recommendation 8 was in relation to any potential scaling or banding that might have been applied to within the RHI. But I think certainly we were talking early on about it's proposed to tier the outputs, and the incentives will be based on heat output, and it was basically to ensure that the appliance wouldn't be sized to fit banding. Rather to fit any banding rather than the actual energy demand, because there can be a knock-on effect there in terms of suboptimal performance with more frequent shutdowns and startups, which can have potential impacts in terms of higher levels of emissions. But I think this recommendation falls away now based on what we've seen in the RHI. Recommendation 9 was around the IrBEA register that Fred mentioned earlier on. I think it's as he said, the IrBEA register has a list of biomass boilers. That's at the moment it's out of sync with the requirements of CR 1189 when that comes into play, and also the MCP where that would be applicable. So there will be a requirement to I suppose to fix that within the IrBEA register for SEI. So they've been informed of that, and that's something that they're aware of. Recommendation 10 is around emission certificate, around certificate of competence for installers in an RHI context and a non-RHI context, and then also a suggestion around flue gas cleaning. I won't go into huge detail, but again, the background behind it was that the appropriate installation of appliances is an important factor in terms of influencing performance and emissions. And we were saying in an RHI context, there should be demonstration of competence of installation with manufacturer's requirements. That would be a benefit. Whether or not it needs to be a certified installer scheme is something maybe to be figured out, given that on a large scale plant you may have teams of guys coming over from the UK or beyond that may not be on the scheme, but maybe more than adequately qualified to install the system. So maybe that's just a factor that needs to be considered. We're saying in the non-RHI context, certainly there are existing or new schemes out there that could be placed on a mandatory footing to, if you like, raise the bar in terms of installation and commissioning of, not in terms of the knowledge associated with installation and commissioning of appliances. The recommendation for flue cleaning and inspection was only a recommendation to consider whether that would be appropriate or not. There are pros and cons, obviously, to flue cleaning requirements in terms of optimal performance of appliances, but certainly if it was applied at a domestic level, there may be issues associated with costs for consumers. Recommendation 11 was in relation to the assessment of potential air quality impacts resulting from individual biomass installations, essentially to determine the impact that they may have in their locality if they were to be located in areas of, for example, poor background air quality from the get-go, and how that can be assessed. We recommended the utilisation of a DEFRA similar tool to one that DEFRA have developed, which is, I suppose, based on using a lot of publicly available knowledge in terms of air quality on 1 kilometre grid squares that they have in the UK, and it, I suppose, carries out a calculation based on stack height and stack width and such like to give you I suppose a maximum emission rate before you have any impact on the background air quality. In an Irish context, we don't have those 1 kilometre square grids of information, but we could perhaps use the air quality information that's gathered by the EPA for the air quality management zones and the air health quality regions as well. This is just a screen grab of the UK system. It's downloadable. It's in an Excel sheet. It's downloadable online. But you essentially input your building height, the height of the tallest building within 5 stacks of the stack diameter, stack height, identify your location. It has preloaded the background concentrations in terms of, example here is PM, and it gives you the target emission rate then that you can emit, that can be emitted, if you like, from the stack. So it's essentially a tool to address, to model the impact of your emissions in a biomass context. Certainly, which may be applicable in an instance where you wouldn't be in either environmental impact assessment, or you wouldn't be applying for an IE license or an IPC license or a waste license or some situation like that. Final recommendation, final slide. Consider means of addressing the absence of assessment of potential air quality impacts resulting from biomass installations developed as exempted development. Touching on the points that Tom made earlier in relation to exempted development, there is a number of classes within the Schedule 2 of the Planning and Development Regulations that allow exempted development for different sizes of biomass or renewable energy technology, should we say. So it is possible to develop a CHP unit in an industrial setting in a structure up to 500 square metres with a building height of 10 metres and a flue height of 20 metres as exempted development. Again, as Tom suggested, you can go through the Section 5 process to confirm that with your local planning authority, but it would be the case that then you don't have to go through a planning regime. I would suggest that at that scale, you can get a sizable biomass installation into a 500 square metre building, certainly several megawatts, and that then would not have to go through any assessment process to assess its impact on the local air quality. Now, not in any way suggesting that exemptions of that nature should be removed. They obviously serve a very beneficial purpose in terms of facilitating the development of renewable technologies. But certainly, if you're developing a tool such as identified in the previous recommendation, it could perhaps be worked into the approval process there for facilities developed as exempted development. Sorry, there, I know I've probably run on a little bit. There are the recommendations that we've gone through. As I said, the report is available on the IrBEA website, and feel free to contact me if you have any questions or queries. Thank you very much.